wearing earrings. I was gonna wear earrings. I've already recorded the whole intro. It's too late at this point. But, hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Mildly Gothic. First things first, I want to apologize for the audio. I am having more technical difficulties, which is why this video may or may not be late. And if it is, I apologize. But, if you're new here, what I like to do is a variety of artsy things. And today is a project that's very meaningful to me. So, I graduated from college this past May, and I graduated with honors. And one of the things you have to do to graduate with honors is a capstone. And even though I was an engineering student, I decided to do a creative writing capstone because I've always been writing. I have a lot of poetry, stories, my mom and teachers can probably tell you. But this story is one I'm very proud of. I think it came together quite well. A lot of back and forth as far as editing. I think there's some pretty strong writing in it. How that's going to translate to what is happening today, not sure. But what I'm going to be doing is I've chosen images that relate to the story. And this is not the entire story. This was about 50 pages long, and so this is part one of what will be 3 of the capstone. And this is not one, if this one doesn't do well, I'm not going to post the others. I intend to complete this project. It means a lot to me, and I'm very proud of it. So I'm going to do my best to read the story in an audiobook style and be engaging and entertaining with it, but also, you know, true to the emotions of the story. And what you're going to be watching is me painting the images that go with it. The timing may not work out, so I may be painting an image that's not directly related to that part of the story, but they're all related to the overall story. So the gist is there's 2 short stories and there's 3 poems in this work. They're designed to play off of each other, and one is designed to be the perspective inside a situation, and the other is designed to be the perspective outside a situation. So it's kind of that juxtaposition, and the poems are meant to reflect the emotional state or thought process that I think should be present at the beginning, middle, and end of the collection. I'm very proud of this work, and I thought this was a really neat idea, and I sincerely hope you enjoy, and I look forward to completing this project. And since you're here, if you've already watched the intro and you've decided to stick around, like, subscribe, comment, tell me if you like the story, if you want to see the next parts. Engagement, as much as I intend to complete this project regardless of what the response is, engagement would be wonderful. Feed the algorithm, feed me, all that jazz. With all that said, thank you so much for getting to this point. I sincerely hope you enjoy, and let's get to it.
Confusion. Breathe when the dust settles. Take in the scene around. Blink as the light returns, illuminating truth laid down. Ponder at the long-laid rubble, thrown down by unknown names. Sift through tragic memories to make sense of all the pain. No answers lie within the dust, just more questions laid out bare. If only the alternate was known, but that's just a distant prayer. Log entry 1. Year 6001.02.3. Location: in transit to Rethon 3. This is the beginning of the official log recording observations and data artifacts concerning the 3rd and 4th planets orbiting the Rethon star. This mission was approved by the Higher Research Authority and is designated a strictly orbital scan and distanced operations. There is to be no interference with the surface. Personally, this is the first mission I have been selected to lead by the Higher Research Authority, so there is much riding on its success. This star is the furthest one our people have traveled to observe. Long-distance data has indicated there are planets in the Rethon system that are in the beginning stages of forming life. However, due to delays in being able to launch this research team and the unavoidable delays in the travel of light and data from another world, we are not exactly sure what state the life on the planet will be when we arrive. For the record, this expedition is composed of 8 crew total, with 6 observers, the main crew being the ship commander, the engineering hand, and the observers consisting of 2 life study specialists, 2 chemists, and the communication specialist and myself, the lead researcher. Supplies are steady, and we are on course to arrive at Rethon in no later than 3 revolutions of our home sun. Adjustments will be made to work on the rotation schedule of the Rethon star. All research crew will compile individual logs concerning data. These logs will contain overviews of mission progress and any events of note that occur. Log Entry 2. Year 6402.26.5. Location: orbiting Rethon 3. Current observation is focused on the migration of the life units on the surface. They seem to be maintaining similar social structures as was observed in their more primitive state. There is a distinction beginning to form between units and the roles they have to the collective of units. Most life units are still located on the largest landmass. The life study specialists have found evidence of past units much greater than those we are observing now. But sadly, we began our observations after the elimination of these greater life units. We are unable to determine how these primitive life units survived while the others perished, mostly due to the restrictions on surface research. The life study specialists believe the only time to do effective surface research is now, while the life units are too primitive to integrate our existence into future social structures. We have submitted an official request to the Higher Research Authority for these restrictions to be lifted. However, it is unlikely they will grant it. We will increase scans and see if samples from the surface can be collected in a non-intrusive manner. Arguments have been made to adjust the focus towards the life units present in the water. However, the life study specialists cannot seem to agree on if this would be a scientifically significant study or just a waste of time. Rethon 4 provided some interesting observations, but conditions do not seem hospitable for life units. Therefore, passive observation will commence. It is doubtful much will arise.
Loss. Stefan squinted against the wind as he tucked his head down further into the bandana wrapped around his neck, trying to protect himself from the worst of it. "Come on, we need to keep moving." He shrugged his backpack up his shoulders, grabbed hold of a stick for leverage, and pushed himself forwards through the torrent. "But it hurts," a small voice wailed from behind him. He turned around and extended a hand. "Come on, Katie, stay with me," he said. She looked at him and pouted, but didn't say anything else. She knew they had to keep moving. They'd left their primary campsite behind just a few weeks ago to journey out across the ruins in search of any other survivors. There was no hope for them on their own, but maybe if they found others, all wouldn't be lost. Katie grabbed his hand and used it to clamber over a pile of rocks and metal. If the wind wasn't so bad, he would carry her, but Stefan was having enough trouble staying on his feet as it was. The forceful drafts had picked up all manners of debris and were throwing it about them, metal, sand, wood, glass, all being pelted against them. He turned back towards the wind, and with Katie's small hand in his, he pressed onward slowly. The stick turned out to be a great tool for leverage against the wind. It penetrated deep in the ground, serving as an anchor when his feet started to fail him. Hours passed, and they pressed on. Eventually, the wind started to die down, and all the debris settled. The struggle was over for now. They slowed to a walk, and Stefan stopped to check in with his sister. Crouching down, he asked, "Hey, how are you doing?" He could tell she'd been crying. Her eyes were bloodshot, brimming with tears, exposed face red from the wind, and he could tell she was exhausted. She just mumbled, I'm fine. He couldn't help but crack a small smile. She was trying so hard. She was trying to be so strong. God, Mom would have been proud of her. If only she could see how far they've made it. He patted her on the shoulder and stood up, surveying their surroundings. Buildings lay in ruin, cars strewn across the street, and roads degrading into the earth. A little way away, he spotted the remnants of an overpass. It had a building right next to it that looked mostly intact. Either one would provide ample shelter for the evening. As they made their way towards the shelter, Stefan would occasionally pull out the axe that hung from his hip to chop up lampposts, signs, or any wooden objects he could find. They would need the firewood. It wasn't long until they got to the overpass. Katie looked more than thankful to be stopping for a rest. Stefan sat down and began to organize what was necessary to start a fire to keep them warm through the evening. Once he got a small flame going, he laid out the thin sleeping bags they had and sat down next to Katie. She hadn't said a word since the wind stopped.
Hey, you. What you thinking about?
I miss Mom, she replied with a whisper, curling her knees into her chest and tucking her chin behind them. He reached an arm out and pulled her closer, so that she was leaning against him.
I know, B. Me too.
For a moment they just stared at the fire together in silence. Will you tell me one of your stories? I want to hear about the before time. She picked her head up and looked at him with puppy dog eyes that he couldn't resist. Chuckling softly, he let her go and shifted to sit cross-legged facing her.
All right, let me see. What story should I tell tonight?
Tell the one about the park. He smiled. The story about the park was the story about how their parents met, and it was her favorite story.
The park? Haven't you heard that one 1,000,000,000,000,000 times already?
He teased her, chuckling. The park, the park, the park! Katie chanted, opening up and smiling.
Okay.
Stefan leaned back, throwing his hands up in defeat, laughing.
The park it is.
Katie settled in, beaming. She lay down and curled up with the little cover she had, ready to hear the story once again.
It was the most beautiful day you've ever seen. The sky was a crisp blue. Big, white, fluffy clouds slowly drifted across, giving the people below shade. The trees and the grass sparkled an emerald green, so vibrant you could almost feel them breathing. And there was Mommy, sitting on an old metal bench. The wind, gentle and cool, lightly blowing her hair, ruffling the pages of her book. It was no matter. She held them down. The wind wasn't going to take her story away from her. But as persistent as she was, the wind managed to steal her bookmark. Right from between the pages, up and away. She chased that purple ribbon all around the park, it managing to stay just outside of reach. That was until it stopped at a worn pair of nice leather shoes. Mama, although stunning, was not the most graceful, and while trying to slow down her chase, managed to tumble right into the owner of those nice shoes.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I was just trying to get my bookmark. I didn't mean to.
The man chuckled at her. Ma'am, you're all right. He helped her to her feet.
Stefan let his voice trail off as he paused and looked at Katie. She was starting to doze off. Her eyelids fluttered as she smiled, dreaming about their mom and the wonderful man who she knocked off his feet.
And they lived happily ever after.
He whispered and leaned back, palms against the ground behind him, staring at the fire. Katie barely remembered the before time, the world before it turned to chaos, before everyone seemed to abandon hope. It had been years since the sky was bright and blue, For too long, it stayed a consistent grayish brown, light in color, but soul-sucking and dull. He quietly rummaged around in his bag, taking note of everything they still had. 2 cans of beans, 1 can of chicken, a baggie of oats, 2 full packs of water, and a half-drained one, 1 roll of bandages, a fishing hook and line, a warped plastic bowl, and the Geiger counter. He could figure out more food, probably figure out more water. But the radiation? That was something outside his control. It had been steady for years, a relatively safe level, since in the beginning they were lucky enough to be outside the worst of it. He wasn't sure what was happening, though, because it had been climbing steadily the more they traveled. The air was getting worse, too. More particles filled the sky, making the already hard journey a nightmare as they fought against the elements. He looked over to Katie. She would be in the 8th grade if things were still normal. Looking up to the prospect of high school, meeting boys, giggling at sleepovers, although who knows how she would have even handled that world. Katie developed a little bit slower than most other kids her age. Late to walk, late to talk, and slow to read, but she had such a kindness in her heart. She used to run outside and pick wildflowers for their mom and come back inside covered with dirt and holding a small handful of bright yellow buttercups. Stefan sighed. She would never have a normal life. What even was normal now? When the chaos hit, her chances of school were destroyed, and as much as their mom tried, Katie struggled, her words and understanding staying very simple. But honestly, it was somewhat of a blessing. No matter their struggle, no matter what they'd come across, Stefan knew he had this little innocent ray of sunshine with him to cut through all those gray clouds. Stefan himself would have been in college if the world hadn't fallen apart 8 years ago. They'd fought to survive for 8 years. It hadn't always been this hard, though. Up until about 2 months ago, they had their mom to guide them, stay by their side, show them what to do. They had lost their dad immediately when the war hit. He was off on a business trip in one of the big cities, and of course, it was one of the places hit first. Stefan didn't know a lot of the details of who started what, why everything fell apart. Their mom didn't think that was important. She didn't want them to have hatred in their hearts, just a love for each other. Damn, he missed her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small chain with a charm. He rubbed the charm between his forefinger and thumb. It was a bumblebee. His mom loved bumblebees. Katie looked just like her. That's why he called her Bee. He didn't know if he would have the strength to keep going if she wasn't around. Sighing, he put everything back in his bag and propped himself up against a wall with his pocket knife in hand. He needed to sleep, but he wasn't going to leave Katie defenseless. So, uneasily, he slowly drifted off to sleep. Luckily, it was an uneventful night. He awoke due to some rustling of Katie turning over and sitting up, yawning. He blinked his eyes to wake himself up as he adjusted to the brighter light of the morning. Putting his pocket knife away, he began to start the fire back up to make them some breakfast. A few minutes later, they were sharing a bowl of plain oats. At least it was filling. They took turns scooping up the mush with their fingers, although Stefan let Katie take as much as she wanted. She needed it more than him. They decided to stay here for the day, getting some rest before continuing their journey west. Stefan decided to try and take advantage of their surroundings. He'd found a few fallen traffic lights with relatively intact colored lenses. He'd found traffic lights in the past, but none with lenses, either looted or broken beyond use. Using his knife, he also cut off some semi-usable rubber from the cars that lay strewn about. He spent the day attempting to fashion goggles for himself and Katie to protect their eyes should they encounter such a horrible windstorm again. "Hey, Bee, come over here. I got a surprise for you." Katie bounced over from the other side of their little camp.
"What you got?"
Stefan held them up proudly, slightly lopsided, held together with a prayer and secured with cut strips from his bandana. "Here, let me help you." She leaned forward and let him place the goggles on her face and tie them behind her head. "They're heavy," she whined. His smile cracked a little bit. "But I love them!" He exhaled, relieved. She ran away from him excitedly. He looked down at the pieces left in front of him. He used the best glass for hers. She deserved it. He had some salvage pieces from the headlights and the traffic lights, so hopefully he could make something usable for himself. He wanted to protect Katie as much as possible from all the elements he could, because he'd started to notice something she hadn't. She was coughing. A lot. Just like their mom had in the weeks leading up to her death. It was just a factor of this world. The radiation, the polluted air. It was damn hard to survive. They'd made it for so long before by staying put, attempting to grow things in the dead soil, digging their well a little bit deeper every so often, and staying inside shelter as much as they could. But once the wells started to go dry and the walls started to show cracks, their mom decided that they needed to get moving. She gave them everything and kept so little for herself, the most food, the most water, and best protection, and the most sleep. She did everything in her power to prevent this cruel new world from taking her children from her, and yet Stefan feared that he was going to fail her if this world took Katie. He managed to finish a decent second set of goggles and heated up half of one of those cans for some food. Again, he and Katie shared and watched the fire dim. She started coughing. He just reached over and lightly rubbed her back in circles.
"Stefan, are we going to be okay?"
She looked up at him with those big eyes.
"Of course we are, Bee. We got each other, and that's more than enough for us to survive."
He smiled at her, but his heart sunk. If she was asking, he wasn't doing as good a job as he thought of keeping his fears hidden. She decided to lay down, rolling away from him. He watched her for a bit, and every so often she would cough, her small body shaking so violently. It was all he could do not to cry. What would his mom do? She would probably spin some fantastical tale, make them both laugh, make them dream about clear blue water and bright green trees and orange pumpkins and red apples, make them forget for a minute about the world around them. Life was easier when she was around. Stefan again sat up with his back against the wall of the overpass, ready to defend his sister if he needed to. He tried to sleep, but his thoughts spun nightmares of their bleak future, so he didn't get much. The next morning, he was the first to awaken. The light seemed brighter today for some reason. He got up and started getting some oats ready for when Katie woke up. She slept later than she usually did, and when she finally rose, he noticed that she didn't look good. Her face was pale and gaunt. How long it had been like that? How long hadn't he noticed her deterioration? He smiled at her.
"Hey, Bee. Want some breakfast? It's almost ready."
She shrugged her shoulders at him and groggily rubbed her eyes. As she crawled out from her sleeping bag and sat cross-legged next to him, he noticed just how frail she was. She was a spitting image of their mom, but not in the way he wanted to remember her. A few months into their mother leading them out in the search for other survivors, she started to go downhill rapidly. They'd found a pretty sturdy building and set up camp. Stefan took over most of the things their mom would do: search for food, tend to the fire, tell Katie stories, and guard the camp each day. It took less than a week for her to go from appearing strong and pushing onwards to being unable to get out of a sleeping bag. God, that week was hard. He took care of her, tried to make sure she ate enough. He didn't want to go on without her, but he knew she wasn't going to make it, and she knew it too. The worst night was the last night she told them a story. She asked Stefan to prop her up, and she told them the most beautiful story of when Katie was just a few years old and Stefan wanted to play pirates. He made her be a parrot, but for some reason she wanted to be the cannonball and just kept yelling, "Boom!" and throwing her arms up. It was a story full of love and laughter, but it was the last time they laughed together. When their mom went to sleep that night, she didn't wake up. Stefan had woken up from Katie shaking him in tears, stammering something about, "Mommy won't wake up." His face went white, and he was lightheaded when he sat up. He knew what happened, but didn't think it would be so soon. As soon as he sat up, Katie threw herself at him, sobbing. He caught her and just held her while she wailed. They had sat together, unsure of what to do next. All they had now was each other. Stefan had taken it upon himself to move their mother's body outside and give her a grave. He couldn't dig a hole, but he could move rocks, so rocks he piled. After an hour or so, she had been covered. They didn't stay at that camp long after. It was too hard, and so they'd been traveling since. So under the underpass they sat together, Stefan looking down at Katie, who was quietly eating the oatmeal.
I'm gonna see Mommy soon.
Stefan opened his mouth, shocked. He closed it, but before he could open it to speak, Katie spoke again.
I know the beeping thing in your backpack is making the "things are getting worse" sounds. And I'm coughing, and it really hurts. But it'll be okay. I'll see Mommy soon.
She looked up at him and put her hand on his knee.
I love you, Stefan. Mommy would be proud of you.
He just looked at her, his lip trembling, eyes starting to fill with tears. He grabbed her in his arms and he hugged her tight. "One day you will see Mommy, but it won't be today, okay? Okay, B? You'll stay with me. I love you. Mommy loves you. That's why we have to keep going. We have to fight for her."
I'll try,
she whispered as she hugged him back. He pulled away and looked at her with his hands on her shoulders. "You know what? Let's have fun today. What do you want to do?" Her eyes sparkled a little bit.
Can we play tag?
He grinned. "We sure can." He barely had time to stand up before she had clambered up and smacked him on the head.
Tag, you're it!
And she tried to sprint away from him. "Oh, you're gonna get it!" He lightly jogged after her. Ducking between cars and through the buildings, they played tag, back and forth, laughing and smiling like they hadn't in ages. It didn't last long, but it was some of the most fun they'd managed to have in a while. They both stopped by the fire circle, panting.
I won!
She exclaimed with pride. "Well, you don't really win at tag when there's only two of us, B," Stefan said while chuckling. He rummaged through the bag and pulled out some water for the two of them.
You're only upset 'cause you're an LOSER,
she taunted, spelling out the last word. Stefan threw his hands up defeated. "You got me. I'm just a big ol' loser." He smiled at her, and she sat down next to him. The afternoon was upon them, and it was much too hot to be running around now. Katie sat in the shade, drawing with a stick in the ground. Stefan had found a pretty solid piece of wood and decided to try his hand at whittling. He'd done it a bit in the past. His dad had tried to teach him several times. So he sat, wood in one hand, pocket knife in the other, and got to work. By the time Katie came to bother him about food, he was quite satisfied with what he had. It was crude, but it was a bumblebee, that's for sure. He presented it to her. "For the brightest bee I know, this is for you." She took it from him excitedly.
Oh, Stefan, it's lovely.
She ran her fingers across the carved texture and sat entranced with it while Stefan got their food together. They sat in silence while they ate. "Would you like to hear a story tonight?" Katie nodded and settled in her sleeping bag. Stefan could tell her breathing was much more ragged than it was yesterday. She had fun today, but it took a lot out of her. Her movements were slow, and her eyes were drooping already. Stefan sat up and went into the best rendition he could of the story of the park, of the beautiful spring day where the lady chasing the purple bookmark knocked over the poor gentleman. He put as much detail and as much heart into it as he could. By the time he finished, she was fast asleep. He rested a hand on her shoulder and felt her body fighting for every breath.
It's okay, Katie. I love you.
He once again settled in with his back against the wall, pocket knife in hand. As he closed his eyes to sleep, he could feel the tears rolling down his face. The morning was quiet, too quiet. The sunlight was there, but dim. A lot more gray clouds to filter through today. He opened his eyes and looked to his right where Katie lay, and already knew what he would find. Her body was still. Her hand was wrapped around the wooden bee he'd given her yesterday. He reached out and touched her face with the back of his hand. She was cool to the touch. His eyes began to fill with tears. He pulled his knees to his chest and just looked at her. He'd tried so hard.
Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I did everything I could. I tried, Mama. Please don't be mad at me. Please take care of her.
He sat there as the morning passed, unable to shake himself from the grief. He couldn't feed himself. He couldn't move. He felt stuck, alone. The only person he had left in this world that made things feel okay, that made him feel alive, feel human again, was gone. By the time the light was reaching the golden hour, he was finally able to get up. He gently picked up her body, cradling her head against his chest, and carried her to an open spot on the ground. He lay her down, organized her hair, placed her hands on her stomach, holding the little wooden bumblebee. Slowly, he found rocks and things to cover her body, to bury her. He wished they hadn't left where their mom was. Bee deserved to be buried next to her mom, not alone, out here in the wilderness, out alone in a world that never cared. But he cared, and their mom cared. The world may have devolved into something less than human, but his mom never lost her faith for a second that there were still good people out there. He tried to hold on to that. He sat back at the camp and stared at the pile of rocks that now stood as the only remembrance of Katie. He wasn't sure what he was going to do from here, but he couldn't just sit still. The radiation was slowly getting to him. The air was tearing him from the inside out, and his strength was fading, but he could not fail. After packing his bag, he stood up. He hung the goggles around his neck with the rest of his bandana, secured his bag to his back, and paused. He turned to look at the grave once more. He was going to push on for Bee, and for his mom. He couldn't lose hope. Someone was out there somewhere, and Stefan was going to find them, or die trying.
Log Entry 3. Year 7312.10.4. Location Rethon 3. There has certainly been much progress with the life units. Gradually, they have expanded across more of the available land masses on the surface. They seem to adapt well to new surroundings. We predict further expansion across the surface, and increasing violence between the leaders of the social structures. Our observers finally got the go-ahead for surface research, and were able to ascertain much more about this planet and its past history. This is a most intriguing case, as these life units are carbon-based and would almost be seemingly ill-fitted to inhabit many of the harsh climates they now do. A rather peculiar life unit, while clearly not the fastest, or the strongest, or even the largest life unit, they are slowly becoming the most prolific unit on the surface. Another set of interesting life units are those that exist in the water on this world, highly intelligent and with their own social structures. We certainly wish to further observe their development. Unfortunately, we do not currently possess the type of craft necessary for proper exploration of the depths of the water. Aquatic exploration was not considered in the original proposal to observe that was submitted for this expedition. which in hindsight was clearly a mistake. However, the engineering hand and chemists are working on creating a suitable craft that will allow for deeper exploration and sample collection, although it seems we will have to wait several rotations before the equipment is fully suitable for exploration efforts. Until then, we will continue to document our findings on the surface and the development of the life units.